All right, I'm Dr. Feist. Welcome back, and we are talking about chapters 8 and 9 of Book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Still trying to figure out a little bit more of what arete, virtue, in the distinctly human sense is, because the main goal, once again, is to understand arete as a distinct characterization, shall we say, of the distinctly human activities of suke. That is, those activities that are directly and indirectly related to reason. And the final thing to always keep in mind, so we don't get lost in all this terminology, which is admittedly easy to do, the goal is to try and figure out what eudaimonia is. And eudaimonia is basically something that we seek. It's fulfilling. It gives life meaning. And all of this is an attempt to figure out what is the good life. And the good life, of course, in Aristotle's view, is ultimately going to be part and parcel of the ethical life. So having a good life and being a happy person, all that means you'll be a good ethical person as well. So there's three, we've been talking about dispositions of soul, or these tendencies of suke. There's three of them. Two extremes, efficiency and excess, and the third one is the mean. And it's easier, of course, to go to excesses and deficiencies, harder to hit the mean. It's a small little target, as I used in a previous video, kind of like trying to hit a bullseye. It's hard because it's easier to hit everything around it than to hit the actual little bullseye. That is a real skill, and you don't just start off doing that. You start off by missing the target, and you get better and better and better at it. Again, as I've emphasized in previous videos, go back and watch those if you haven't. Training is a key thing. Habituation, getting a good character, getting a good ethos, is a product of doing good works over and over and over again and getting better at it, like you get closer and closer to the bullseye. And in this case, the bullseye that we're talking about in ethics is the mean. So they're all opposed to each other, Aristotle says, in this sort of structure, shall we say, deficiency, excess, and mean. So they're opposed to each other. But it's not a perfectly symmetric one. The mean is not a mathematical notion in ethics. It can be a mathematical notion, as we saw in a previous video, but it's not in ethics. It is always a mean with respect to us. So ethics is always related to human beings. It's not an abstract set of rules like physics or mathematics that could have nothing to do with us, right? We may just discover it or whatever, but it's nothing necessarily to do with us. Ethics is necessarily to do with us. Ethics is necessarily a combination of general rules and particular circumstances that are not easily subsumable under general rules like you have in a science like physics. So Aristotle makes, in this chapter, he makes a few comments about how these all relate to each other, stressing that it's not this nice, neat, symmetric notion. So how we typically view things, Aristotle says, affects how we view the extremes, right? For instance, rashness is thought to be closer to courage, say, than cowardice. So the rashness is over here, cowardice is over here, courage is here. So rashness, the mean, and courage, the mean, are thought to be closer. So again, this is an asymmetric kind of structure, and it changes according to circumstances, different people and whatnot. So it's quite fluid. This also, the second cause of this kind of asymmetry, in addition to how we tend to view things, and it is interesting that Aristotle notes that how we tend to view things is a good example of objectivity, again stressing that he takes a lot of things as given from the society that he's operating within. And again, that raises a whole host of problems, but I'll deal with that notion of Greek society in another video. Stay tuned for that. But the second cause of this become from our own natural inclinations. Remember, Aristotle doesn't think that we're born completely like blank slates. He does say, nature inclines us in certain ways. From the cradle, we've kind of been pleasure-seeking sorts of creatures. Some of us maybe more than others. Maybe some of us are a little more inclined to go off in the bad versus the good direction. But the point is that these inclinations aren't really like hardwired into us in the strong sense that the way the stone has the inclination of always seeking the earth does. You can't habituate a stone, as we've talked about but you can habituate out of this kind of nature-given simple inclination. You can put the brakes on those, control them, and manipulate them. That's what habituation is essentially all about. So there's going to be certain differences with regards to our natural inclinations, which will affect this structure as well. So there's a number of reasons why we have this asymmetric form of this structure, and it's not a simple mathematical type expression. All right, so again, we can't habituate ourselves if things were actually hardwired. So when I use this term inclination, don't read it as something that you cannot control. For Aristotle, that's the whole point of it. It is something that you can control and shape. As long as it has a deficiency or an excess, it's something that will admit of a mean, and it's something that you can hit the mean if you're willing to practice it. Now, this has still been, admittedly, a fairly abstract discussion. And Aristotle will slowly but surely try and unpack that. We've seen a little bit of unpacking in terms of that laundry list that you see in chapter 7. So you can go back and read that. And I talked a little bit about that in a previous video. But in chapter 9, Aristotle actually gives us 3 tips on virtue. And they're really centering on how to hit the mean. Because, again, it's hard. It's easier to go for deficiencies and excesses. There's just more targets, and it's easier to hit those. Hitting the mean is difficult. It takes it takes practice. It's a skill that you develop, but of course you can develop it and you can get better, unless your psyche is completely broken or whatnot. But by and large, people can do it, but it's difficult. And Aristotle in this chapter does admit that, it is pretty hard. So he offers us 3 tips on how to hit this mean. Now, first, he says what you want to do is, and he uses various kinds of analogies, but I'll just slim them back, is, what we want to do is avoid the further extreme from the mean. That way, if you don't hit the mean, then the extreme you will get will be the lesser of 2. So it's kind of a lesser of 2 evil. So the first one is, instead of trying to directly hit the mean, instead of going and aiming right at the mean, avoid the more extreme. In the situation. Right? So if you're in a situation and you notice that there's the 2 extremes, one extreme will be, shall we say, more extreme than the other. Avoid that. And then at least if you get it wrong and you hit the other extreme, it's less of an extreme, and you increase your chances perhaps of hitting the mean. So in this case, it's sort of a lesser, this is a lesser of 2 evils type of argument. Now, also, Aristotle is always asking us to reflect on ourselves. And he says, look at your own pleasures and pains. Look at your own personal history. Right? Be honest with yourself. Look at the things that drive you, that push you around. The inclinations that you have. Maybe some bad habits that you have, etc., etc. Well, look at your own pleasures and pains and look at where you naturally are tended to drag. So, oppose your own, shall we say, natural extremes. So if you're someone who's always looking for pleasure or something like that, well, maybe that's what you push against. That's what you or pull back from. And in that sense, you have to look at ethics as a very personal type of action. You drag yourself in the opposite direction. So oppose your own natural extremes, and then you've got a greater chance of hitting the mean. So these are certainly, as Aristotle would freely admit, these aren't, absolute knockdown arguments here or absolute rules, but they're just sort of general tips on virtue, which will help you to at least increase the odds that you're going to hit the mean. So avoid the more extreme in a situation and beware of your own natural extremes. And of course, we've gone from a lesser of two evils type of argument to oppose your own natural extremes. This is again kind of a know thyself type argument. Know who you are. Know what you're naturally going, the extremes you naturally go to, and pull yourself back from that. A little self-control will help out. Third, if you watched the previous video, Aristotle said, a big part of the character virtues is getting pleasures and pains under control. Right? Getting them under control, having the right attitude, the right reason with respect to those, as a virtuous person should, or virtuous person would have with respect to those. So in this sense, you should be on guard against certain things. And Aristotle says one of the things that we should all be on guard against is, and he's mentioned this in many places, is that from the cradle we are essentially pleasure-seeking creatures. We should be very careful against the dangers of pleasures. So be aware of the dangers of pleasures. This is what gets us most often into trouble, is the pursuit of pleasure. And as he said repeatedly, this is something that we've lived with since we were babies. We're kind of born like this with an inclination towards pleasure. And if we can get that under control, or even maybe dismiss it as much as possible, we are less likely to go astray. Read that with a bit of a grain of salt here, because remember, Aristotle is not saying that you have to be some sort of strong stoic or an ascetic or anything like that. But just take it as a warning that pleasure is one of the ones that really tends to lead us astray. And if you think about when people get into trouble, it's usually something to do with that, whether it's bodily pleasures or all kinds of pleasures that humans seek. That tends to get people most often into trouble. So in sum, when you look at it, Aristotle is freely admitting it's incredibly difficult to hit the mean, to be a truly virtuous person. Not only do you have to be accurate in hitting the mean all the time, but you have to do it as a virtuous person would. So even if you accidentally get it right, you're not really in the thick Aristotelian sense of getting it right. You're kind of conforming, or as Kant would say, it's a good act, but it doesn't have any moral worth. For something to be a true moral act or virtuous character, true character virtue for Aristotle, it has to be more than just an accidental striking of the mean. But at least, you have to start somewhere. And of course, hitting the mean is a key one. But never forget that just merely hitting the mean, that's certainly a necessary part of being a virtuous person, but it is absolutely not sufficient. All right, thank you, and stay tuned for more videos.